In part one, we were investigating the number of things that exist, and we're looking at Peter van Inwagen's book, The Metaphysics, and the answer to this question. And we explored the possibility that nothing existed at all, that was nihilism. And van Inwagen rejected that. And so now we're going to go to the answer of one thing exists, and that's the view of monism. So monism is the thesis that there is just one single individual thing, and that this thing is necessarily singular. Now, this is a view that goes all the way back to Parmenides in ancient Greek philosophy, and so it has been around throughout the history of philosophy. People take this view very seriously. So the idea, again, is that everything there is either a universal, a stuff, an event, the one, a mere modification of the one, or a collection of mere modifications of the one. So that kind of covered the options that we described existing in the first video. So what people take this view, and why do they take it? Well, a prominent philosopher who takes this view is Spinoza. And his view is that everything is really a mere modification of the one, capital O, one. So there is only one thing that exists, and the things that we call individual things like trees or cats or peanuts are actually modifications of the one. So here's the argument that Spinoza presents, according to van Inwagen. And so there are Spinoza scholars that may differ somewhat on the reasoning here, but I think it does fairly well at representing Spinoza's rationale. So first premise, if a thing is not absolutely independent of everything else, then it must be a modification of something that is absolutely independent of everything else. Now, this is a crucial premise. For Spinoza, it's an axiom, it's a starting point, so a very important claim. Second premise, there must be at least one absolutely independent being, because if there's anything at all, there has to be at least one. And Spinoza argues that there could not be more than one absolutely independent being, because the rationale briefly is that then if there were two, the one might rely on its existence in some way or another, or its properties in some way or another on the other. So there can't be more than one. So we have one absolutely independent being, one and only one. And all the other things that we think are individual things in the universe, including you or I, right? We are just modifications of the one. Now, van Inwagen, I think, represents his rationale fairly well. And like most Spinoza scholars, the question here is, how do you support A? How do you support this claim that if a thing's not absolutely independent of everything else, then it must be a modification of something that is absolutely independent of everything else? And van Inwagen just says, well, it's stipulated, but it needs support, and you can't find any support. Now, even Spinoza scholars continue to kind of search for his rationale for premise A, and there's disagreement about that. So some people have proposed various rationales for A, but there's certainly not a consensus about that. And van Inwagen says you just don't have any, you can't find it. Okay, another view, another person who's a monist. The idea is individuality is a complete illusion. So the things that we think are individual things are actually illusions to us. So this is an absolute idealist view. And one notable proponent of this view is F.H. Bradley. And his reasoning we could put fairly simply in this way: if there are two or more things, then there are external relations, and we'll discuss what those are in just a second, all relations are internal, and so there's only one thing. You can't have two or more things because all relations are internal. So let's explore this idea of internal and external relations. The external relation or relational properties are those had only in virtue of the ways that something is related to something else, such as being a brother, or being 50 miles north of a burning barn, or being taller than Bill. These are properties that are relational. We would call these relational. You can only have them if something else exists. Now, intrinsic or internal properties are just a couple examples: being square, having a mass of 14 kilograms. Those are internal or intrinsic properties. Now, if you know about the difference between mass and weight, weight is actually a relational property. It's a relation to the Earth, but mass is not. So you would have the same mass no matter what planet you were on, but you would weigh differently according to what planet you were on. So anyway, mass is an internal property. Now, one way of thinking of this, suggests Van Inwagen, is imagine that there was a perfect duplicating machine, a duplicator that could reproduce an object perfectly. Now, generally speaking, the internal properties are the ones that are going to be duplicated. So just because the one individual happens to have been north of a burning barn in the past, if you duplicate that individual, the duplication is not going to have that property. But if it's square that you're duplicating, the duplication is going to have the property. So that's just an intuitive way of getting a grip on internal properties. It's not perfect, so it's not by any means a definition, but it's a way of thinking about this. How do you get this? Now let's go back to Bradley's argument. And in his argument, he said that all relations are internal relations. Well, what's the support for that premise too? Why think that all relations are internal relations? Well, his argument goes something like this. Suppose that there are two things, so X and Y, and those are related by the external relation R. So for example, Joe is taller than Bill. Well, the fact that X, or Joe, and Y, or Bill, stand in R, Joe being taller than Bill, that fact is not due to any intrinsic properties, right? So there are no intrinsic properties just by definition that make it true that Joe is property taller than Bill. There couldn't be. So that doesn't make any sense to say that. So what is the explanation, Bradley asked, for why they're in that relation? Why do X and Y stand in that relation R? And they say that, Bradley says, that the only plausible response to the question is that there would have to be an external relation R star that makes this fact true. So there has to be some other relation that correlates to X, Y, and R, that is R star, making it true, because it can't be an internal relation, so it has to be an external relation. Now, let's continue on with our support here. The problem is now, what makes it true that X, Y, and R stand in relation R star? Again, it cannot be intrinsic properties, so it must be an external properties. So there must be an R double star, of course, but now we have a problem because we can use the same reasoning to conclude that there has to be an R triple star, and so on and so on. So we have this infinite regress of external relations, says Bradley, and that's not possible. The infinite regressive relations cannot do the grounding that we need. So instead, intrinsic properties must ground the relations. So there are no external relations. External or extrinsic relations don't exist. So that's why we have the second premise. All there are internal relations. All relations are internal. Now, how might one respond to this argument? One response is to say, wait a minute, there are brute facts. So the idea that X and Y are in R is just a brute fact. It's a fact, and there's no further explanation to it. Explanations have to stop at some point, and this is one of those situations. X and Y is in R. That's just a brute fact. So there's no need for intrinsic properties to explain the fact. There's no need for a further external properties to explain the fact. It's just a brute fact itself. Now, if there are no brute facts such as these, so somebody might say, wait a minute, I don't buy it that there are brute facts. Well, if there are no brute facts like these, then intrinsic properties are going to suffer the same regress as external relations. So you would have to ask questions like, what makes it a fact that A is F? What makes it a fact that this object is square? Having this internal property, there must be a further property that explains why, right? But Van Inwagen, of course, thinks there are brute facts. And if you take this idea that there has to be an internal property, or even with internal properties, you have to have this further property to explain why the internal A has F, for example, something has an internal property, then you have an infinite regress. Now, Bradley seems to have been aware of this. Okay, so it's not necessarily a criticism of Bradley yet, at least. He was aware of the concern, it seems to be at least, about intrinsic properties, and apparently argued accordingly. Obviously, the way I'm speaking, I'm not that familiar with Bradley, so I'm not speaking with authority on this, but I'm relying on what Van Inwagen is saying about Bradley. So if there are no intrinsic properties, as Bradley would seem to accept by the rationale that he gave for external properties, and that applies for internal properties or intrinsic properties. So you don't have any of those, and that means even the one lacks properties. And apparently this is affirmed by Bradley. So Bradley says, yes, that's true, the one lacks properties. Now here is where Van Inwagen says we have a problem. There seems to be a contradiction in the view. So while it may be claimed that the one lacks properties that can be known by humans, maybe it doesn't have any properties that we can know. That's an epistemic concern. The conclusion of the reasoning here, the rationale concludes that the one lacks all properties. But that's something different. That's a metaphysical conclusion. That's a metaphysical claim, not an epistemic claim. So, but how could that be? How could the one lack all properties? It can't. For example, it would still have the property of producing experiences that we have, or maybe it would have to have the property of being experiences, if you like. For example, those things would have to be true of the one. The one would have to have some property. So it seems that the argument for the second version of monism failed. So Van Inwagen rejects Spinoza's rationale, and he rejects Bradley's rationale, and he goes on to consider one more rationale that we will see pretty quickly does not pull much merit with him for good reason. The third version is each of the individual things that we think exist and are individuals are actually the one. So the bird is the one, and you are the one, and I am the one. Now, why would you think this? Well, there really aren't any philosophical arguments for this per se, but the claim is that mystical experiences can show us this. So from the Upanishads, we have particular passages that say things like, thou art that art thou. I am one with the universe, we might hear people say. We, and we have to put it in quotes there, are the same, because we're the same thing. So it's not a we, it's an I, and it's just one I, and the I is the bird and the tree and the building and the chair, right? Now, of course, Van Inwagen, being a philosopher, is not going to go for this without an argument. And the problem, one of the problems at least, seems to be the pervasive inconsistency of the experiences that people have. So broadly speaking, we have in the East traditions that might support this, but in Western traditions, we have experiences, people that report mystical experiences that don't support this. So there's an inconsistency there with the experiences themselves. And so Van Inwagen